Hello wonderful people, it is Genevieve, and in this video we're going to draw some watercolor pumpkins, or any type of squash really, in Procreate. So open up the app, create a new canvas, and let's start drawing. So this tutorial is pretty much straight to the point. It is fairly easy, but make sure to stick around until the end because I will show you a few interesting techniques that we can now use with Procreate 5X, which is the new version of Procreate. So make sure your app is updated as well as your iPad. We're going to start by creating a new layer as usual, and we're just going to draw the general shape of the pumpkin or any squash. So you can use this tutorial, the same technique, to draw any type of squash that you want, like acorn squash or just like a really cool decorative squash. So the color that you pick is totally up to you, but I'm just going to go with the regular pumpkin because, you know, might as well. So a nice bright orange. And I personally will be using the watercolor brushes from my Ultimate Watercolor Toolbox, which I will link in the description below, along with their promo code just for you guys, as always, if you want to check it out. But feel free to use any brush that you want from Procreate that you know you like. It's probably going to work as well. But if you want a watercolor effect, I highly recommend these brushes. So if you do have the Ultimate Watercolor Toolbox, go ahead and pick the basic watercolor brush. So the shape for a pumpkin, at least, is kind of an ellipse with some wavy elements in the top and the bottom. So go ahead and draw that and then fill it in. And once you have that, you can always use the arrow tool here to just put it where you want in your canvas. We're also going to draw the stem. So for that, go ahead and pick a pretty desaturated brown color. And I'm going to use the same brush. And all you're going to do is draw this very stumpy stem. So it's fairly thick, and usually it has like a funky curve in it. So feel free to experiment with that. And you can see, since we're using watercolor brushes, we have this overlap here. So we're just going to use the water blender or the blending tool if you don't have the watercolor toolbox. And we're just going to kind of blend this edge a little bit so that when we zoom out, it looks fine. We're also going to do this interesting trick, which is we're going to duplicate the layer by swiping it towards the left and clicking on duplicate here, which, as you can see, just makes the color a bit more vibrant and dense. And then we're just going to merge the two layers together by squishing them with two fingers. So that's a good way of just kind of amplifying the colors that you already have on your piece, especially when you're working with transparent brushes. Once we have that, we're going to add some of the texture of the squash. So we're going to go back to the orange that we had, but we're just going to make it slightly darker and more saturated. And for this, I'm still going to use the basic watercolor brush. So what we're going to do is basically we're just going to draw some curved vertical lines that start from the upper curved line of the wave shape at the bottom, if that made any sense at all. So just like this. To the other one as well. And then I'm going to draw some extra ones on the sides. And maybe a very thin one here. Here. And then we're going to zoom in and just add a little bit of dimension, because that's kind of where the pumpkin connects together here at the top. So what we're going to do is we're going to connect these lines here with the stem. And we're going to also connect the lower part of the top waves with the stem. So you see that kind of gives this characteristic pumpkin shape to our pumpkin. So next, you're just going to thicken the lines a little bit. And we're going to do a similar thing on the stem. So go back to your dark brown gray that you used and make it even darker. I'm going to make the brush smaller, and you're just going to draw some vertical lines that follow the curved stem part here. just a few of them, but these I won't thicken them because, you know, it's thick enough already. And we're also going to blend the curves a little bit. And to do that, if you have the watercolor toolbox, I highly recommend that you use the watercolor wash, but if you don't, just use the blending brush here. And for the watercolor wash, you can pick a color. So I like to pick kind of a yellow-orange type of color. I'm just going to go over the edges of my curved vertical lines to blend them a little bit, but while still maintaining the general idea of this vertical curved line. So you can see when I'm blending, I'm not going across this way, I'm really following the curves. All I'm doing is I'm just blending this more digital looking strokes. So go ahead and do that on your curved lines and feel free to pause the video. I will meet you at the next step. So once you have something that looks like this, you're honestly done with the hardest part of the tutorial. All we're going to do now is add some really cool details and techniques that are going to make this piece just look a bit more interesting, because you know, right now it looks like a pumpkin, but it doesn't really look that good. So now we're going to make it look good. The first thing I like to do is tweak the shape a little bit, because you know, we went a bit quickly. And to do that, there's this really cool tool in Procreate, which you can access using the adjustment panel here and selecting Liquify. And if you set the tool to push with like a medium size, basically what you can do is just push the color on your canvas around without having to redraw everything. So that's a really nice way to just tweak your shape slightly and get something that you like a bit more, you know, in case you are not super happy with what you did so far. So feel free to take as much time as you want and tweak your pumpkin. I quite like mine, so I'm just going to stop there. So the first kind of details we're going to add is some light effects. And to do it, we're going to use the eraser tool. And if you double tap on the eraser tool, it actually opens the whole brush library. So you can change the eraser that you use. If you have the Ultimate Watercolor Toolbox, pick the color shifting brushes. Otherwise, pick a brush that has some texture to it. And we're going to erase some vertical curved lines on one side of the pumpkin. And that kind of follow the darker lines that we have. So I usually draw 2 or 3, just kind of like that. In the center one, I also draw some sort of like circular or blobby shapes, just to make it even more noticeable. And I'm also going to just erase kind of in the middle of the stem. Now we're going to add some color variation, and if you've watched my videos before, you probably know the trick that I used to use, but there's now a new trick that we can do in Procreate 5X. So I'm going to start by showing you how to use the old trick, which is really easy. Basically what you do is you use this selection tool here, set it to freehand, and you select one part of your artwork that you want to change the color of. So in my case, I'm going to add some shadows on the bottom, so I'm just going to select a wobbly selection here on one side. And then you feather that selection, so clicking on feather here, around 35% or something like that. And going to the adjustment panel here, selecting hue, saturation, brightness, which used to be here at the bottom, but with Procreate 5X is now here at the top, which I'm really happy with. And you're going to select the layer option. And that's going to open up hue, saturation, brightness here. And since I'm adding a shadow, I will just lower the brightness, which you can see lowers that brightness with a nice gradient that smooths in your color. And if we deselect, we see that we now have some sort of a shadow on one part of the pumpkin. We could also do the same thing to add some lights, so go ahead and use the selection tool, set to freehand, but this time on the other side of the pumpkin, mostly on the top, creating a funky wobbly shape and feathering it somewhere around 30%. Hue, saturation, brightness, layer, and then this time you would lift up the brightness and maybe shift the hue towards a bit more yellow. So something like that. And you can see now your pumpkin has a lot of dimensions. But there's now a new way to do that. And I kind of like combining both. So with your layer selected, all you have to do is basically bypassing this selection tool here, going back to hue, saturation, brightness, and instead of selecting layer, you select pencil. And it's going to open up the same menu here at the bottom. And I quite like to just kind of put all the settings completely crazy just so I know what I'm doing. And you're going to see that if you draw over, it's doing the same color variation thing. One thing that is really important to note is that the brush that you use is very important. So for example, now I was using a really soft brush, and that's why you are not seeing any hard edges. But if I went here and used like this flat brush here, you would see that I have really straight edges. So if you want to use this color variation technique, which I highly recommend you do, just make sure that you have a soft brush. And if you have the Ultimate Watercolor Toolbox, pick the Watercolor Wash. It is absolutely perfect for the job. So anyway, what we're actually going to do for this pumpkin or this squash is we're going to draw some like random shape over the pumpkin, and we're then going to shift the hue just so we have some color variation, because no pumpkin is the exact same color all over, and especially if it is watercolor, you know, watercolor pigments tend to blend with each other and just have a lot of different hues to them. So play around with the hue, you can play around with the saturation too, and even with the brightness. You can really do what you want at this point. All you want is to have a bit more color. And you can repeat this step as many times as you want. I think this is enough, but you could do it again and have something that is a bit more red or green, whatever you want. So we're in really good shape. All we have to do at this point is to add a few details, and if you've watched any of my tutorials, you're probably expecting them by now. And they are the splatters and the salt brush. So let's start with this salt brush because it is my favorite. So in the brush library here, Ultimate Watercolor Toolbox, just go ahead and pick the salt brush. And the color of that brush doesn't matter. All that matters is that you start the stroke from kind of a white surface or a transparent surface, and then you drag it in towards your color. And you can see just add some really cool white speckles. And you can play around and change the size just so you get some size variation. And it just adds dimension and makes the piece more interesting in my opinion. We're also going to add some splatters just to kind of counterbalance that. And to add splatters, I like to create a new layer and to change the blending mode of that layer to linear burn. We're going to use the same orange that we used at first for the pumpkin, so go ahead and select it in your history. And we're going to use the splatter brush for this. And kind of on the opposite side where I did my salt brush, I'm just going to sprinkle some splatters, as you can see here. So there you go, this is how to draw or paint a pumpkin in Procreate. And like I said in the beginning, if you just change the color or the shape ever so slightly, you can totally create a bunch of different squash. And if you want your squash or your pumpkin to have this really cool watercolor look to them, make sure to check out the watercolor brushes, which I will link in the description below, with a promo code just for you guys. And while you're there, make sure to give this video a thumbs up. Leave a comment below if you have any idea for a tutorial you'd like to see, or just any feedback in general. I always love to read your comments. And last but not least, don't forget to subscribe because I put out new videos every week.